أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum dear students. I hope all of you will be doing fine and having great time with your families. So today we will talk about the next part of our discussion about Vietnam War. In the previous lecture, we talked about the origin and the colonial phase of the Vietnam War, in which and we also talked about how the Vietnam was taken by the Japanese forces during the Second World War, and we also had a brief overview of the reclamation of the Vietnam by the French forces after the Second World War, and how the war mm, got developed between the French forces and the Vietnamese Ho Chi Minh forces led by Ho Chi Minh, and eventually the defeat of the French forces and the ultimate involvement of American forces, and the turning of this conflict into a Cold War conflict between the American and the former Soviets. So today we would talk about the extensive involvement of the American troops in the Vietnam War and the tactics. We will also have an overview of the tactics employed by both the American forces and the Viet Cong led by Ho Chi Minh, and we would also talk about the impacts of this Vietnam War, uh, especially on the US. So, we in our previous lecture we had a very brief discussion about the involvement of US in Vietnam, and today in our today's discussion we will have a thorough discussion about the extensive involvement of the US in the Vietnam War. So, when the US got involved in the Vietnam War, the government of the Republic of Vietnam was established, which is also called the South Vietnam, and it was supported by the Americans. Uh, Didn't mean Din Dim was the one who got the backing of the Americans, and eventually won the elections and became president. Diem immediately began attacking the North Vietnam, and it was like he was very unpopular because of the charges of corruption against him, which led to the opposition from many citizens. And in order to confront that, the National Liberation Front was established, On December 20th, 1960, the National Liberation Front was founded, and anyone could join as long as they opposed him and wanted to unify Vietnam. Those who were in the favor of reunification of Vietnam and opposed the rule of New Diem in the South Vietnam, they were welcome to join the National Liberation Front, and it is also known as the Viet Cong. So this National Liberation Front was led by Ho Chi Minh. He was quite popular in the North Vietnam. So at this stage of events, the war, the conflict has already been started between North and South, and the Americans were siding with the South Vietnamese government, and they, in order to destroy the morale of the Viet Cong, the Americans tactics involved both ground forces and air operations, and Operation Rolling Thunder was employed under the air um, involved attacks, and the bombing of North Vietnamese towns was the policy to destroy the morale of the Viet Cong. So they were involved in a tactic which involved search and destroy missions. They used to look for the Viet Cong in the villages, and if they found any presence or any clue of the presence of the Viet Cong, they, instead of targeting those suspected Viet Cong, they burned the whole villages. The whole villages were destroyed. We can see in these pictures that how the American air forces and ground forces got involved in the Vietnam War. So with uh, the deployment of US troops got increased in huge numbers with the passage of time. In the start of the conflict, it was almost non-existent, and from 1963 to 1968, the deployment of US forces in Vietnam went over 500,000 troops. And when we talk about the ground forces operation launched by the American troops, they didn't have any territorial goals behind that. So it involved usually body counts on TV every night, and first it was known as the living room war. So in 1965, sustained bombing of North Vietnam was North Vietnam was bombed continuously by the American Air Forces and under the operation of the Rolling Thunder, and they kept on bombing Hanoi non-stop for 3 years, and the targets of these bombings were the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was a passage from North Vietnam to South, which was used by the Viet Cong. So the key target of this Rolling Thunder operation was to destroy the supply lines, and both the US came up with the usage of chemical weapons as well, and it demonstrated the, we can say, the um, we can say that the US forces were so, we should say, like, they were not winning in a way as they anticipated. They had to face severe resistance by the Viet Cong, and um, it demonstrated the disappointment or disappointment of the US forces, that they, instead of using conventional weapons, they came up with the use of non-conventional weapons to destroy the morale of the Viet Cong, and they used napalm and Agent Orange. Napalm was a fluid that burns through almost everything. The Americans, while using that chemical agent, like chemical weapons, they hoped that it would hit Vietnam bases, but in fact, it often hit civilian. In this picture, we can see that the children and common civilians were hit hard, and the Agent Orange destroyed crops and trees, and the human body, which led to birth defects. So it was inhuman act done by the American forces in the Vietnam War. So now the question emerged was, who is the real enemy? The Viet Cong, apparently the American forces were engaged to engage in a battle against the Viet Cong. They were farmers by day and they were guerrillas at night. They were very patient people, willing to accept many casualties. The US grossly underestimated their resolve and their resourcefulness. They were like sort of inspired by some of the quotes of Mao Zedong. I would like to quote one here. According the Mao Zedong once said, like, the gorilla wins if he does not lose, and the conventional army loses if it does not win. So that was the sort of resolve most of the guerrilla fighters under the title of Viet Cong, they were quite inspired, and they had a firm resolve to fight against the enemy. Now we will talk about the Vietnamese tactics that were employed in this war. Viet Cong, they came up with guerrilla tactics, and they were fighting against the South Vietnam forces along the American troops that were helping the South Vietnam. So now we will have a brief overview, like guerrilla warfare, what sort of guerrilla warfare was launched by the Vietnamese people, especially by the Viet Cong. The guerrillas didn't directly confront strong opponents but employ hit and run tactics, sabotage, assassination, and terrorism in order to exhaust and harm the enemy. So one of the most common tactic employed in warfare tactic is not to directly confront strong opponents, like equipped with advanced military technology and weapons, but rather to employ hit and run tactics, and that also involved sabotage, assassination, and terrorist activities in order to harm or in order to hurt the morale of the enemy. And it also led to digging of tunnels as shelter and fighting bases, and these were the common tactics used by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. And the one other strong element involved is the popular support. Popular support is very crucial to guerrillas. If the guerrilla warfare tactics are supposed to be effective, popular support is necessary. Here, I would also like to talk about the Ho Chi Minh Trails. It was a network of roads that stretched from North Vietnam through eastern Laos to South Vietnam. It was the main supply route for Viet Cong, and it played a key role in the Vietnamese victory in the Vietnam War against the American troops. The American air operations tried their best to destroy these supply lines, and the tunnel system which was by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. And here we can see the tunnel system which was employed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. This tunnel system involved underground passages and trenches. It is utilized both as a shelter and as a you know the attacking post, we can say. So in this picture we can see that the air vents have been hiding under the bushes, and like the and the entrance was kept hidden under a cooking pot. So these tunnels and the Ho Chi Minh Trail were very effective and helpful that eventually helped the Viet Cong to defeat the enemy in the Vietnam War. And the American forces like tried their best to destroy the um, Ho Chi Minh Trail and this tunnel system, but they couldn't succeed thoroughly in that. So before talking the responses, it is imperative here to talk about the Tet Offensive, which happened in January in the start of 1968. North Vietnamese army known as the Viet Cong attacked South Vietnam, and they attacked simultaneously 100 cities, bases, and the US embassy in Saigon. Uh, and most of the major cities were taken over by the Viet Cong, and eventually the US beat back the offensive. Viet Congs were destroyed, and the North Vietnamese army got debilitated, but still it was seen as a defeat of the American. By the though in the battlefield the US forces were the victorious, but in the media it is um, seen as a defeat of America. So, talking about the impacts and responses of this Vietnam War in general and Tet Offensive in particular, like even way before that, Tet Offensive by 1963, when Kennedy began supporting a coup of Diem was who was leading the South Vietnam, was captured and killed. And 3 weeks after that incident, Kennedy was assassinated too. The new President Johnson, mm, like he believed in a more aggressive action. He believed that the more aggressive action was required by the Americans, and it was like a blank check for him. Like both the Congress and the House of Representatives gave him a free hand, and he came up with the option of deploying huge number of American troops in the Vietnam War. Here I would like to talk about the incident of Gulf of Tonkin. Like it was a short-term event that caused the escalation of the war. In 1964, U.S. destroyer Maddox reported to be fired by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, and the second attack on was launched on Sea Turner Joy by the Vietnamese forces, and eventually Lyndon Johnson claims unprovoked aggression and orders airstrike against North Vietnamese torpedo bases, which culminated into Operation Rolling Thunder. So that was the incident which triggered massive military conflict in the Vietnam War, and American troops got engaged extensively in this conflict. So when we talk about the overall impact of this war on the U.S., the domestic U.S. reaction, like the reaction of the U.S. public, was not very supportive of it. They were quite critical of the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and people started showing disbelief, anger, and distrust of the Johnson administration. And there was a slogan which was quite common. It reads as, "Hey, hey, Johnson, how many kids did you kill today?" So people were becoming quite wary of the US involvement in the Vietnam War, and eventually, the impact of the US, the people against the US administration involvement in the Vietnam War can be noticed from the statement made by Johnson in 1968, that I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. So he decided not to run for presidency for another term, even though he was offered to run the election again. So as the war continued, more and more people were drafted and more deaths were counted, and eventually the protest occurred in the United States as well, particularly on college campuses and in major cities at first. But by 1968, protest could be seen all across the territory of the United States. The Tet Offensive, which was launched by the North Vietnam, coordinated attacks against the major southern cities designed to force the US into a negotiation. So, one of the key objectives of the Tet Offensive was to bring the Americans on the table of negotiation, and they were quite successful in that. It was effective, and these protests in the US were very effective, and many people in the US were growing war weary, and it also impacted to the US involvement and performance in the Vietnam War to great extent. So anti-war demonstrations also started in almost the whole territory of the United States, and the slogans was raised, "Hell no, we won't go." They were asking the American administration to disengage their troops from the Vietnam. While quoting the anti-war demonstration on May 4th, 1974, students shot dead, 11 students wounded, and in on May 10th, 1970, at Jackson State University. Two students got dead and 12 wounded in those anti-war demonstrations. So, and the time, it was the time of the election in the United States as well, and both the candidates from the Republican and Democrats, they were like utilizing this Vietnam War as a campaign, as one of the elements, key elements of their campaign. So Nixon in 1968, his campaign promised an end to the war with the title "Peace with Honor," and the he aimed at coming up with the policy of especially in the context of Vietnam War, like he aimed at withdrawing American troops and giving South Vietnam greater responsibility for fighting the war. He was looking to slow the flow of North Vietnam soldiers and supplies into the South Vietnam under this Vietnamization policy, and eventually Richard Nixon won the election in the United States, and he wanted like to have a ceasefire in the Vietnam War. So when so after actually after the Nixon, sorry, in 1973 the ceasefire was reached, and North Vietnam, and it was signed between US, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. So President Nixon's policy was to end this war with honor, like to evacuate the US troops from Vietnam with honor, not with humiliation. So finally, the ceasefire was reached in 1973 between the US forces, South Vietnam, and the North Vietnam. And during the these peace negotiations, in which Dr. Henry Kissinger also played a key role, it lasted for 5 months over the size of the conference table. And the conditions of the ceasefire involved US to remove all troops. North Vietnam could leave troops already in South Vietnam. North Vietnam would resume war. No provision for prisoners of war. Last American troops left South Vietnam on March 29, 1973, and North Vietnam defeats South Vietnam in 1975, and Saigon renamed as Ho Chi Minh City. So that's how the ceasefire got concluded between all the parties operating in the Vietnam War. And finally, the on April 1975, the unification of Vietnam was achieved, and South Vietnam surrendered to the North, and Vietnam was reunited. And during the Geneva Accord, which was signed in 1956, called for an election to take place to choose the government of a reunified Vietnam. So the reunification of Vietnam was achieved eventually in 1975, and that's how the war concluded between the Vietnam War concluded. While talking about the cost of this Vietnam War, 100,000 Vietnamese got killed in this war, and around 60,000 Americans got killed too, and around 300,000 wounded in this war. And the US morale and self-confidence and trust of government also decimated, and when we talk about the impact of this Vietnam War on the US, it resulted into a 26th amendment in which 18-year-old given the right to vote. Nixon abolished the draft all volunteers army, and war power. Regarding the War Power Act, uh, it came under greater scrutiny in 1973, and the according to these War Power Acts, President must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military force, and the President must withdraw forces unless he gains congressional approval within 90 days. Here I would like to mention the quote or the resolve of the Ho Chi Minh, who led the Viet Cong. He was of this firm resolve that if we have to fight, we will fight. You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill one of yours, and in the end, it will be you who dies of it. And that is what eventually happened in this Vietnam War, and the Ho Chi Minh forces got emerged as victorious because of their firm belief and tactics employed by them in this Vietnam War against the American and South Vietnamese forces. So there are some lessons to be learned for future American presidents. Some of those are like wars must be of short duration, wars must yield few American casualties, and restrict media access to the battlefields, develop and maintain congressional and public support is sort of necessary, and set clear winnable goals, set deadlines for troops withdrawal. So these are the sort of lessons that can be learned from this for the American president, future American president from this war. So this war played a great role in the development of Cold War in the Asian continent, and it is still known. It still impacts the international politics, and eventually It was President Clinton who formally recognized the Vietnam on July 11th, 1995. So that's all for today's lecture, and we would come up the next topic of our scheme of study in the next lecture. If you have any queries, I would also share some related reading material files with you guys in our WhatsApp group, so that you have a thorough analysis or a thorough reading about the conflict of Vietnam War. And if you have any queries, please feel free to raise your question in our WhatsApp group, and I would be quite happy to answer your questions. So stay safe and healthy. See you next time. Allah Hafiz.